Hello and welcome, my friends and viewers, to this week's episode of Legendlore, where I draw and talk about monsters, characters, gods, and other things from D&D 5th edition, all while giving a small but quickly digestible history about them. Together we'll go over their origins within the game, how they're utilized in the modern edition, and how you guys can utilize them in your own games. Before we get started, I want to let all you guys know, if you guys want to vote on the next video in Legendlore, please do follow the link in the description below to be able to choose what kind of content you guys want to see on this channel. But today we're going to be covering a mainstay in not just D&D, but in fantasy games and fantasy worlds as a whole, the jangling, classic, low-level skeleton. As most people here probably already know, skeletons are corpses infused with necromantic energy to become animated, with the only difference between them and a zombie being the distinctive lack of skin and muscle tissue. Anything that had a skeleton in life could become a skeleton in undeath, including wolves, trolls, ettins, and even giants, each holding their level of strength and danger depending on their size and how completed their skeleton was. Spells like Animate Dead allowed those who studied necromancy to create skeletons from nearby corpses, but they could also rise spontaneously when exposed to or residing in locations filled with evil or necromantic energy, such as rifts to the Hells or the Shadowfell. There are also a great number of skeleton subtypes, each with their own differences and additional abilities, and we'll go over a few of them in depth later on in this video. But for a quick list, animal skeletons were, as you would imagine, animated from the corpses of a beast, creating things such as warhorse skeleton steeds or skeleton hounds that could chase down all manner of prey. Baneguard skeletons were created by priests to the dark god of strife, Bane, and had the ability to phase in and out of existence whilst hurling bolts of magical energy at their enemies. Skeletons known as Blazing Bones were skeletal undead engulfed in flames as a result of a spellcaster's contingency spell going wrong. And if the condition of the contingency spell was to keep the spellcaster alive, it would be a little bit horrifying to imagine them remaining sentient as their skeleton burns simultaneously. Bone bats are a skeletal creature made to emulate the appearance of a bat, either by raising a singular giant bat corpse, or being formed out of multiple pieces of normal bat bodies, almost like a pseudo-swarm of undead bats in a way. Burn bone skeletons, which is different from the blazing bone skeleton, were originally powerful priests of the god of chaos and lies, Cyric, who we covered in a previous Legendlore video. Being transformed into undead as a favor from the god himself, they serve as high-ranking officers within the clergy, and are often compared to creatures known as Bane Liches, who serve the god Bane in the similar capacity that burn bones do. Reflecting back to Baneguards for a minute, those Baneguards who are captured and improved upon by the Church of Cyric, or even by the Red Wizards of Thay, can become known as Dire Guards, skeletons who still had the same powers as Baneguards but were wreathed in a shadowy force that could also function as armor, and were also capable of seeing invisible or incorporeal enemies. Dreads were a very special type of undead, formed only out of a pair of skeleton arms and a powerful enchanted blade that held the form together. Their movements implied that the rest of the skeleton's body was simply invisible, but this ruse was often exploited by dreads in order to strike a foe who left themselves open attempting to strike their non-existent body. Skeleton warriors, which once again are different from skeletons who just so happen to be wielding a sword or other weapon, are powerful undead born from the bodies of great warriors, retaining all of their fighting skills and enslaved to magical circlets. Oftentimes, they were highly resistant to magic and difficult to control, and so skeleton warriors were often relegated to groups of 2 or 3 at most. Skeletal dragons were able to retain some of the deadly abilities that they had in life, but this is not to be confused with the Dragolich, who retains both their draconic and magical prowess as a result of their necromantic rituals. I've created stat blocks for a couple of these skeleton variants, and they're all linked in the description below, such as the Dire Guard, the Burn Bones, the Skeletal Warrior, and the Dread. Beyond that, there's a wide variety of many other different skeletons that I didn't cover that you guys can find and learn about to stick in your games. And I do eventually want to go back and cover each of these different variants in order to provide a much more varied selection of skeletons for you guys to use in your table. Being mostly animated undead, skeletons don't usually have a natural behavior beyond the commands given to them by their creator upon being raised. However, due to the innate necromantic energies within the Shadowfell, and its concurrent ability to turn abandoned corpses into walking undead, a skeleton made under these conditions could follow the simple desires of the Fell and its undead forces, which is to consume life and make more of its kind. As such, naturally made skeletons would wander and be keen to find living creatures and free the trapped skeleton inside of them. Unlike zombies and bodaks and such, skeletons don't really have a drive to consume flesh or life source, due to them having no actual instinct to feed. I imagine that this is because a skeleton lacks a stomach and the bioorganic material that eating would provide nutrients for, whereas zombies still have pieces of bodily matter and an instinctual echo in their minds to eat and consume as they did in their previous lives. This puts the skeleton in a very unique position of being an undead that purely kills and seeks to make more of itself, and I could even imagine a skeleton's necromantic aura infesting other skeletons, in order to raise more as they relieve weary adventurers of their flesh, muscle, and their very lives. Skeletons could also be created when bodies have been completely sapped of life force by creatures such as Bodax, having fed so much on these victims that their very skin, organs, and muscles have withered away because of the Bodax proximity, leaving only bones to remain and rise to continue the cycle. Now, in terms of magical components, skeletons unfortunately don't really hold much in terms of those, but necromancy-infused bones can definitely be used for a variety of dark rituals such as lichdom, demi-lichdom, or even the creation of something like a skull lord. You can also flavor magical items as being formed of raised skeleton bones. A wand of the War Mage can be a beautifully honed ivory wand formed by necromancers to cast necromancy spells more easily. A Mace of Disruption can be a bone-forged Morningstar with ribs serving as its spikes, and a Staff of Withering can be made from a blackened, calcified spine. I'm also very sure that there's use for the skeleton's ashy bone marrow that has been soaking in necrotic undead energy for who knows how long. Now, in terms of combat, in older editions, animated skeletons were immune to mind-altering effects and could not be rendered exhausted or unconscious due to their undead nature. Edged and piercing weapons did very little damage to them, while bludgeoning weapons were often the most effective way of breaking and knocking the bones apart. Despite these mostly physical resistances, skeletons could be turned and otherwise destroyed by paladins, clerics, and other wielders of divine might, as with most undead. 5th edition has sort of watered down the skeleton for the purposes of simplicity, so I've included an updated skeleton stat block that harkens back to its original strengths. You can find that in the description below. When deploying skeletons in combat, you can be sure to expect that any inanimate skeleton the party comes across while going through a dungeon will have its body and head smashed to bits out of paranoia. Unless you have a group of first-timers on your hands, and even then, horror movies and Indiana Jones may have conditioned them accordingly. As such, don't let that stop them from rising when the time is right. You can lull your players into a false sense of security that they already ended any potential combat before it's begun, only for them to come face to face with that skeleton all the same, their shattered head sort of reformed into a cracked, broken visage. When you finally do have the skeletons rise, be sure to sprinkle them at a variety of different ranges so they may present your party with a variety of problems to solve. Skeleton swarms will run up and overwhelm the front line, while skeleton archers will pepper them with arrows from a distance, also hitting the front line but also targeting those pesky spellcasters at the very back. Also, even though this may be a bit of an easy assumption to make, do be sure to telegraph the skeleton's resistances to necrotic and non-bludgeoning attacks. The knowledge that undead are unaffected by necrotic damage should be something any spellcaster of any level would know, and perhaps a skeleton could emerge and approach the party with a spear or sword stuck inside of it, and its body being completely unharmed. Hopefully your party will pick up these context clues, and even if they don't, a simple intelligence check is all you would need to do to divulge that information. For our Dungeon Master resources, we have 2 quests and a puzzle that you guys can use, all centered around the skeleton and the concepts that we had just discussed. For the first one, the Not Just a Knee replacement puzzle, your party has entered into a necromantic dungeon, and the first room contains only 2 things, a hallway leading into another chamber, and a puzzle with the shape of an open coffin filled with only a golden skull, as well as many slots that match the shapes of all other bones in the humanoid body. As a party ventures into the other chamber, they will discover that each of the skeleton enemies that rise up to meet them has one bone that is gilded, the same gold as the skull that they encountered in the coffin. It is up to them to find every skeleton within these walls that has these bones so they can assemble the golden skeleton together, solve the puzzle, and allow the coffin to open so they may venture into the dungeon's true depths. This is supposed to be a very simple way to bait your players into exploring a dungeon that you made, while also making them feel like they're solving a puzzle and accomplishing a goal with each bone that they find. And you can use a variety of different skeletons for each of these encounters to steal their bones. You could have a regular skeleton here, a couple of skeleton warriors over there, perhaps a Bane Guard as the penultimate final boss before the one that's behind the coffin door. It could be very interesting. Perhaps you could even have one of the skeleton's heads pop off and reveal it to actually be a flame skull, another monster that we've covered here on Legendlore. Next, we have a quest known as the Vanishing Bones. A local peasant has been raving throughout the village about how his brother's grave has been unearthed and ransacked, and tasks the party to investigate with what little gold he has. Using their detective skills, the party realizes that there's actually 2 pairs of footprints, and follow them off into a cave where they are greeted by either a pair of skeletons or a necromancer and his undead army, to which the brother's skeleton has just been added. Now, if you guys choose to instead have a skeleton pair, this draws upon the idea that skeletons can make more of themselves by being in proximity to unanimated bones. So one skeleton who crawled from the black depths of the Shadowfell could have come across the grave and unknowingly risen the brother's bones, the newly formed skeleton simply following the source of its creation. This could be a very interesting way to show the intricacies of necromancy and undeath in your world from a scientific standpoint, and I'm sure your necromancy wizards and your death clerics will both appreciate the lore and the detail. On the other hand, using the raising of an already buried skeleton as a lure to bring your party into conflict with the necromancer is a good way to subvert the old approach of the kingdom giving the party the task or something like that. It shows how necromancy and its activities can affect people on a smaller individual level, given the grief of the brother, in contrast to seeing a horde of undead that you know nothing about across the horizon to siege a city. And for our final quest, we have the Collective. Now, this quest idea uses a creature known as a Bone Collective from Kobold Press's Tome of Beasts, which I highly recommend getting as it has some very excellent third-party monsters and art. I know a lot of people are going to say that this doesn't relate to the skeleton monster in itself, but just listen, I think it'll be very interesting. Building a little bit more on the Vanishing Boat quest that I just previously gone over, instead of one corpse being raised, the nearby area of villages and towns have experienced a sudden raising of graves and the vanishing of bodies. This may not necessarily mean that all the bodies are present and completely gone, with the party having to investigate and find out where it went, more so that other locations have been reporting sights of skeletal bodies hiding in shadows and crawling bony hands scampering across the land. Upon the capturing of one of these skeletons or bone pieces, the party can study it, and discover that it has a distant arcane connection that spreads out to dozens of other bone pieces, all of which are being controlled by a singular bone collective with an insidious purpose, which will be decided by you, the DM. Perhaps the collective is trying to ascend to a higher echelon of undeath, such as a Skull Lord or a Lich, or maybe the Bone Collective has been constructed out of the mixed consciousnesses of all these bodies fused into one, either by the presence of necromancy naturally in the area, or as a result of an even darker plot that is currently underway. Rather than using the Bone Collective as its own creature, have all skeletons mix and form together into this mass creature. All of these different crawling claws and moving hands and bodies that people have spotted all over the land, sort of acting as a pseudo-hive mind, reminiscent of illithids but in necromancy. And for this week's Legend Lore inspired magic items, guys, we have 3 this video. The first one being the Ossein Rod. The Ossein Rod is a wand formed out of necromancy-affected bone that requires attunement, and gives the wielder a +1 bonus to spell save DCs and spell attacks made with spells of the necromancy school. It also allows the wielder to cast the spells Bane or Inflict Wounds at will as a bonus action. In order to create an Ossein Rod, yes, I'm including ways to craft these items inside of your game, the wand must be made from a skeleton who has recently been struck with a necromancy spell, so be sure to plop this in front of your death clerics or your necromancy wizards as a goal to reach, even if they do it by creating a skeleton themselves and blasting it with a cast of Inflict Wounds or something. Next, we have the Marrowstar, which is a +1 Morning Star that requires attunement, dealing an additional 1d6 necrotic damage on a successful hit. Being a +1 Morning Star, it gives a +1 bonus to attack and damage rolls made with it, and additionally, once per short rest, the wielder may use a reaction to empower their next successful hit. On said hit, all creatures within 10 feet of the wielder must make a DC 15 Wisdom saving throw. On a failed save, they suffer 1d6 necrotic damage and only suffer half on a successful save, and the wielder then regains an amount of HP equal to half the total amount of damage dealt to all enemies by this ability. The healing cannot cause your HP to go over its maximum. For math simplicity, for people who are worried that this might be a broken item, the maximum a person can heal from this item is 72 HP, and that's if they have an enemy in every space that the ability affects, and if they all fail their saves, and if you roll a 6 on every single damage die. I personally don't believe that's really broken, but again, every game is different, and there are a lot of Dungeon Masters who want to control the damage output, lifesteal, and healing that the party has. And lastly, we have the Spinestaff, a +1 staff that, you guessed it, requires attunement, and deals an additional 1d6 necrotic damage on a successful hit. It also has the ability to cast the spell Bane once per short rest, the DC being your own spell save DC, or 14. This includes the key ability save DC for monks, and here's why. An additional ability when wielding this item, when you make an attack against a creature who is currently affected by this staff's cast of Bane, your first attack is made at advantage and deals 2d6 necrotic damage instead of 1d6. This ability lasts so long as the creature is affected by the spell Bane that is specifically cast from this staff, meaning that if you use your own spell slot to cast Bane, it will not be under the same effect. I've included the art and item stat blocks for these items in the description below. And with that, that's the skeleton, everybody. I want to thank all of you guys for watching, and if you guys enjoyed the video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Let me know how you guys have encountered or used skeletons in your games, and once again, if you guys want to vote on the next video, please follow the link in the description. This week it's going to be classic D&D characters, Kasana, the co-creator of Alias, who we've covered in a previous Legend Lore video, Strongheart the Paladin, member of Valor's Call, and an immense enemy of the League of Malevolence, and finally the evil Archmage Zigig. Follow the link, let your votes be known, and please, let me know what other things you guys would like to see in upcoming videos. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.